My husband sent a text saying he had good news, but 20 minutes later he was sliding a DNA test across the table and telling me our daughter wasn't his. I need you to know a few things about me before we get into this. I'm 43. I manage logistics for the Kentucky National Guard. I spend my days tracking supply chains, and if you've spent any time around military personnel, you know they don't appreciate the unexpected. Neither do I. My life is built on certainty, knowing the sequence of events before they unfold. So when my husband Daniel texted me on a Friday afternoon, I let myself believe, just for a short time, that a surprise could actually be wonderful. He'd been in the running for a promotion at his construction firm for a while. That had to be it. On my way home, I picked up a strawberry cheesecake from the grocery store, the one he always likes, with that shiny glaze he'd pick off before I could even slice it properly. Our daughter Olivia was restless in her car seat, tugging at my collar as I carried her inside. I remember thinking this was going to be a good night. We haven't had many of those lately, not since she came along. We had her when I was 42, after years of appointments, needles, and waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and disappointment. I noticed the cars before I noticed the tension. My parents' Buick, Daniel's mother's Lexus, parked hastily. His brother's truck was taking up half the driveway. I actually smiled, thinking he'd really planned a surprise party. Maybe the cheesecake was just for show. But the moment I stepped through the front door, the energy shifted. The television was off, which was unheard of when his mother Margaret was hosting. My own mother didn't stand to greet me. She just looked at me like you look at someone about to walk off a ledge, waiting to see if they fall. Daniel was sitting at the coffee table. A manila folder sat in front of him, positioned perfectly straight. I stood there holding the cheesecake and no one took it from me. "Emily," he said, "sit down. We need to handle this like adults." He offered me a tissue before he even said what was wrong. That's the detail that sticks with me. The tissue, as if he'd practiced the performance of kindness. Then he slid the folder across the table. Inside was a DNA report stating he was excluded as Olivia's biological father. I laughed. I actually laughed because the accusation was so far from any reality. I knew that my brain just short-circuited. "We tried for 4 years, Daniel," I said. "You were in that clinic waiting room with me." But he just looked at me, flat and emotionless, like he'd already decided the facts didn't matter. "The laboratory doesn't care about our history," he said. Margaret spoke up, accusing me of using her son to raise another man's child. My mother asked if I had a confession to make, as if I were a teenager caught sneaking out. My father said nothing at all. And out of everything that happened that night, his silence is the thing I still feel in my chest when I'm lying awake at night. I looked at him, pleading, "Dad, you're really going to wait for me to explain this?" He just stared at the carpet. That's when I realized this wasn't Daniel losing his mind over a piece of paper. He had a separation agreement prepared. He wanted me to admit I'd left voluntarily, and he had a clause to sell the house during the split. He said if I signed, we could keep it private, as if he were doing me a favor. I told him the house was mine, inherited from my grandmother. He brushed it off, saying we could argue about ownership later. I didn't sign anything. Margaret pointed at the door and told me to leave. I was still holding the cheesecake. Then, at 6:31 p.m., the front door opened and Richard Holloway walked in. He's the estate attorney who handled my grandmother's affairs for 30 years. I had scheduled that appointment weeks earlier, after I caught Daniel taking photos of my house deed and Olivia's trust papers. I hadn't told him I was meeting Richard because I didn't want to accuse my husband without proof. Daniel assumed Richard was there to seal the deal on his divorce plan. Richard surveyed the room, saw the tissue box and my mother's face, and said, "Mrs. Carter, I can see this is a bad time, but given what's on that table, I believe I arrived at exactly the right moment." He picked up the report and looked at Daniel. "Who collected your sample?" he asked. "And who collected the child's?" For the first time all night, Daniel didn't have an answer. Richard didn't declare the test fake. He just asked the right questions. Which laboratory issued it? Did anyone check ID? Who swabbed Olivia? She's 13 months old. She can't consent to anything. Is there an original report or just this single printed copy? Daniel said he used a private mail-order kit. Richard nodded, explaining that a private kit can satisfy personal curiosity, but it doesn't hold up in a legal proceeding. He told me not to sign a thing. He told Daniel that I couldn't be kicked out of a house that had my name on the deed. Legally, I could have stayed, but I looked around the room and knew I didn't want my daughter breathing in that environment. Richard wasn't telling me to leave because Daniel had the right to make me, but because it was the right thing to do for my own sanity. I packed a bag, my laptop, my badge, and her stuffed rabbit. I left the cheesecake on the table, sitting there next to the folder like a cruel joke. As I walked out, Daniel said, "Leaving is going to look like an admission." "No," I told him. "Leaving means my daughter doesn't have to sleep in a room full of people calling her a mistake." I checked into a hotel. The room smelled like bleach and old coffee. Olivia wouldn't sleep in the crib, so she stayed curled on my chest, and I stared at a water stain on the ceiling shaped vaguely like our state, running through every fertility appointment in my head, trying to find any crack where a mistake could have slipped through. There wasn't one, but fear doesn't listen to logic. I called my mother, hoping for an apology. She said, "I want to believe you, but Daniel showed us scientific proof." I hung up. Here's the thing that scared me more than the accusation. It wasn't that Daniel might believe the report. It was the growing cold feeling that he never believed it at all, that he'd planned everything down to the tissue box. The next morning, Richard explained why he'd really come to the house. He told me he was there to check for liens and move original documents, just as we'd planned weeks before. His arrival wasn't luck, it was a meeting I'd scheduled out of quiet suspicion. Richard called the laboratory on the report. The company was real, which knocked the wind out of me. But the case number didn't match their formatting, and they had no record of a test under Daniel's name or Olivia's initials. Richard still wouldn't say fraud. He wanted it in writing. My father showed up at the hotel with groceries and diapers. "I didn't know what to think," he said. "You didn't have to know what was true," I told him. "You just had to know your daughter well enough not to let them throw her out alone." He left the groceries and walked out. That afternoon, Richard called again. "They never issued that report, Emily," he said, "and someone recently tried to open a credit line against your house. The application didn't go through because the house is mine alone, free and clear. Daniel didn't have the legal standing to pledge it, but the attempt was real. It was built on the documents I'd caught him photographing. That wasn't a coincidence, it was a plan." Richard brought in a divorce attorney who specialized in financial disclosures, a forensic accountant named Dana Ruiz, and a licensed investigator. It took weeks. Dana doesn't do dramatic reveals, she works in spreadsheets. She found about $245,000 in liabilities. Sports betting losses stretching back years, cash advances on cards I didn't know existed, and unauthorized transfers tied to his construction firm expense account. His employer was already starting an internal review before any of this went down at my house. Daniel knew a normal divorce would expose all of that. He needed something faster. A private settlement where the house was sold. He walked away with a lump sum, and I somehow inherited responsibility for his debts. The DNA report wasn't meant to hold up in court. It just had to work on me for about a week, just long enough for me to sign. He was betting on my pride. He knew I worked around soldiers and hated gossip. He was betting that signing fast would feel easier than defending myself. He wasn't wrong about the fear, but he was wrong about me. The piece that changed everything came from Dana weeks later. She found a life insurance form where Daniel had listed Olivia as his daughter, no qualifiers. A daycare enrollment form where he signed as her father. And days before the ambush, an email to his brother Jason. Once she believes the report can embarrass her at work, she'll settle before anyone checks the numbers. It wasn't a full confession, but it told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't panicked. He'd studied me for 15 years and weaponized that knowledge. Those weeks were hard. Daniel froze the bank accounts, forcing my attorney to file for temporary orders just so I could buy groceries. I missed work. Olivia got sick. My mother kept texting, just consider what's best for everyone. There was a night where I almost took a smaller settlement just to make it stop. I told Richard, I can earn more money, I can buy another house, I don't know if I can keep waking up like this. He said, he's not offering you peace, Emily. He's offering you silence and charging you for it. Then Dana called with more news. Daniel knew the auditors were coming Monday morning. He had days left before his secrets stopped being secrets. We filed for temporary orders. Nothing dramatic, just the legal scaffolding to prevent him from selling the ground out from under me. No major asset transfers, restored access to funds, a parenting schedule. Daniel treated it like an act of war. He started telling people I brought in military lawyers to intimidate him. A laughable claim since Richard is a soft-spoken 70-year-old estate attorney, but Daniel needed a story where he was the victim. I never got a clean recording of him confessing. What I got was carelessness in text messages. You can make all of this disappear by signing what I gave you. The report already convinced your parents. A judge won't be harder. Jason started asking questions. You said this was just to get her to cooperate, he texted. You never said the paperwork wasn't legitimate. Even Margaret reached out, uncertain for the first time. Daniel told us the test was ordered by a doctor. Is that not true? None of those messages alone proved much, but together they painted a picture. The hardest part wasn't the lawyers. Under the temporary schedule, Daniel got supervised visits with Olivia. She'd see him and light up and say "Dada," like nothing had happened. I'd have to turn away and busy myself with her shoes or her bag because I hated what he'd done, but I couldn't hate the fact that she loved him anyway. My attorney, Patricia, put it plainly, protecting Olivia doesn't mean protecting Daniel from what he did. There was one moment in the misery that made me laugh. Dana sent me a screenshot from Facebook Marketplace. Daniel had listed his Rolex, the one I bought him for his birthday. The buyer asked if he had the original box. His reply, my wife took it during the separation. I hadn't touched that watch. I laughed until my eyes stopped being dry. Then I looked at Olivia's reflection in the dark laptop screen, and the laugh went out of me as fast as it came. Around that time, his employer put him on administrative leave. Daniel called, blaming me. Financial records created suspicion, I told him. I only asked to see them. He offered a revised settlement, still asking me to sell the house and share the debt. Patricia and I decided not to show our cards before mediation. If we were wrong, it would cost us months, but something told me Daniel needed to believe he had the upper hand until the last second. At the mediation table, he slid the new agreement across and placed a silver pen on top. Sign it, Emily. We can tell everyone we both made mistakes. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder of my own. Before I sign anything, I said, I think your attorney should see what the laboratory actually said about that DNA report. Mediation rooms are beige and boring. No theatrics. Patricia laid it out piece by piece, written confirmation from the lab that they never issued the report, records of the attempted credit line, the hidden debts, the messages. Daniel tried to say someone else must have altered the report. His attorney didn't look up from the papers, just asked quietly to speak with his client. They came back and said mediation couldn't move forward until Daniel produced complete financial records and explained the disputed document. It was quiet, professional, and somehow more damning than any outburst. I didn't walk away with everything. The unfair settlement was pulled off the table. A full financial examination was scheduled. Daniel's credibility was shot. A real DNA test was ordered, done properly. It confirmed what I already knew: Daniel is Olivia's father. It didn't surprise me, but seeing it typed out on an official form made me cry in the parking lot. Not relief, exactly. Anger, that the truth about my own daughter had needed a piece of paper to be believed at all. Margaret asked for a family meeting. She wanted the same people who'd sat in that living room to hear the truth where the lie had happened. I didn't want another staged scene, but I needed it closed. This time, I didn't walk in carrying a cheesecake. I set a folder on the table and went through it plainly. The first report was fake. The real test proved paternity. He tried to borrow against a house he didn't own. He hid debts. His own messages showed his intent. Jason admitted he'd helped gather everyone but believed the test was real. Margaret turned to her son. "You let me call that baby a stranger in her own home." Daniel defended himself. "I needed Emily to cooperate." "You didn't need cooperation," I told him. "You needed me too ashamed to ask questions." Then he said the thing that undid him. "The test wasn't supposed to go to court. It was supposed to make you reasonable." No one spoke for a long moment. Frank stood up, buttoned his coat, and looked at his son. "You turned your daughter into a bargaining chip. I don't know who taught you that, but it wasn't me." He walked out. My father spoke next. I waited for proof before I stood beside my own daughter. "I was wrong." I told him I appreciated it, but I wasn't ready to pretend that night hadn't changed something between us. Margaret set the family photo face down. I didn't smile. I just picked up Olivia, said goodbye, and walked out. 10 months is a strange amount of time, long enough to change everything, short enough that you still flinch at a text on a Friday evening. Daniel's consequences came slowly. He lost his job. His professional license is in disciplinary review. He reached a civil settlement regarding the credit line attempt. He enrolled in a gambling program. No handcuffs, just a man slowly losing the life he built on borrowed trust. I kept the house for a while. But every time I walked into that living room, I saw the coffee table. I saw my father staring at the carpet. I sold it. That wasn't Daniel taking anything. It was me deciding that owning something and feeling safe in it aren't always the same thing. I bought a smaller brick house in Georgetown, enough room for Olivia to grow up without every hallway carrying a memory that isn't hers. Daniel completed 6 months of treatment. Our conversations stay narrow, pickup times, doctor's appointments. During a visit he told me, I told myself I was protecting us from losing everything. "You were protecting yourself from being found out," I said, and I meant it kindly. He asked if I'd ever forgive him. "That's not the work in front of us," I said. "The work is you becoming someone Olivia can actually trust." My father built her a playhouse in the new yard. I stayed polite, keeping distance. Then one afternoon he put down his hammer and said, "I keep wishing I'd stood up that night." "So do I said. That was the whole conversation, but something started to soften after that, a little more each week. The way most real healing happens, not in one moment, but in 100 small ones nobody else notices. Last Saturday I sat on that new porch watching Olivia chase bubbles. One drifted up and burst against my palm. I sat there just watching the wet spot disappear. I used to think revenge would look like watching Daniel crumble, but justice turned out quieter than that. It looked like keeping my daughter safe, like refusing to sign something unfair just because I was tired. It looked like consequences landing on the person who earned them. I learned that a lie doesn't get its power from being convincing. It gets its power from making you too ashamed to ask a single question. Daniel expected me to disappear. I did leave, but I never surrendered my daughter or the truth. If someone you trusted ever tried to rewrite your story, I'd love to know what helped you hold your ground. Share it in the comments if you're willing. Someone listening tonight might need the same reminder I did. Being exhausted doesn't mean you're defeated.